The Penre Papers. A Journey Through the Multiverse. The Third Level of Learning. http://wespenre.com. The Third Level of Learning. Paper Number 3, Channeled Entities Part 2, Channeling the Greys. By Penre, Wednesday, February 20, 2013. http://wespenre.com. Part 1. 1. Abstract. A short summary so far. In the previous paper, and the latter half of the paper before that, we were talking about the channeled sources who had one obvious theme in common: the harvest of souls. When we look at these different sources one at the time, we tend to think that they are all separate from each other, telling their stories based upon what the questioners ask them. However, if we cross-reference them, we find something very different. It's hard not to get the feeling that they are all connected somehow, and at first we feel it, but we don't know why. Then we notice that they all use terms we've heard so much before, and they are all Syrian terms, such as the Ra material, Marduk Ra, Elohim, the Anunnaki/Syrians, Council of An, Anu being the king of the Anunnaki, the Council of 12, Enki/Marduk's council to decide what to do with us Lulus, the Council of Elohim, which would be the higher council in the Syrian hierarchy, the off-worldly one, and Ptat, or Te, which was Enki's name when he was the first pharaoh of Egypt. So we have the Ra material, the Elohim, the Cassiopeans, Quo, and the Alpha Draconians, not yet discussed, and I know there are more out there who have these Syrian terms in common, and they are all here for the harvest. They all deny such a connection to the Syrians, and Ra even said their name was taken for totally different purposes, but there are too many coincidences just to write it all off. From what I can see, they are here to pull in as many light workers and truth seekers as they can into their fold, and they are using different channels to have as much variety as possible. They cure the blind, heal the crippled, and spread an enormous amount of love and light around them, so we will think they are genuine and positive in nature. Some sources say that they are basically here to assist us in the afterlife when this lifetime is over, by handing out 4D bodies for those who have been good and have their heart chakras open 51% or more. After that, those 51% will enjoy their next lifetime in 4D. But if you don't meet the criteria, your only option is to be recycled to a new 3D planet. This is what many of them want you to believe. Others, like David Wilcock's RA people, say they will come down in spaceships and bring us to the fourth density while we're still here, in incarnation. Wild, but many people fall for it. The sources belonging to this group of channels say they are riding on a cosmic superwave which is heading our way, and on this wave both good and bad entities are riding. Once it's here, it's going to sweep over the solar system, and if you're ready, it's going to be a very uplifting event, but if you're not, it can be quite a negative experience both for the body and the mind. Of all the people who are unprepared, not everybody will die, but many supposedly will. Laura Nightjadchik, who is in contact with the Cassiopeans, spent approximately 1,600 pages on her website explaining and discussing the wave. This is as much as we've discussed the harvesters of souls and their agendas so far. However, to get the full picture of what is going on, we need to look into the Greys, and especially the Zeta Reticulians, and establish who they really are. And lastly, we're going for the real shocker, the Alpha Draconians. When these groups are exposed, it should be pretty clear for the reader what this is all about, and many will be shocked. In fact, I've found out a whole lot more even within this week and a half since I released my previous paper. 2. Channeling the Zeta Reticulians. Germain is a group consciousness energy, who states that his orientation is from a realm of integration that does not have a clear-cut density/dimensional levels. The term Germain in the English language means significant relevance, or coming from the same source. Germain chose this term to somewhat personify his energy. Neither male nor female, he views us as evolving to become like him as we begin the process of physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual integration, which leads us back to the source of all. The above quote opens up a 360 pages long document which is basically a collection of channeling sessions, articles, and documents from between 1992 and 1999, by and with channeler, Lisa Royal. It's no longer online, from what I know, but has some revealing information in it. Germain is one of several group consciousnesses that Lisa is channeling. This group extended out from an earlier Arcturian connection. Arcturus is connected to Enlil and the Syrian alliance, which I will prove beyond any doubts in a later paper. Many people think of Arcturus as the home of some very spiritual, non-physical beings after have read the book, We, the Arcturians, but like the Cassiopeians say that these beings are not from Arcturus. The whole book was just a way to prepare us to be able to understand the concept of non-physicals. Some say that the Tall Whites, an alien group working for the government on a military base in Nevada, near Nellis AFB, are coming from Arcturus. We are going to look into that connection and relay it to the Syrians in an upcoming paper. Another source Lisa is channeling is Hironi, who happens to be a Zeta Reticulian Grey Hive consciousness. Hironi, who is the spokesman for this hive consciousness, is a project leader for some genetic projects, and we get the impression that he is an expert on it. The Greys are genderless, but both Lisa and I prefer to call him he for simplicity. In addition to this, Lisa is also channeling a female being, Sasha, who is from the Pleiades, and lastly Bashar, who is another Grey consciousness, claiming to be us in the far future. All these beings and group consciousnesses are connected to each other in one way or another and are assisting each other in the goal to create a future society based on human hybrids. I have read a few interviews with Lisa Royal, and she comes across as a very intelligent, rational woman, and I can tell she is a person with a good heart. She is the author of a number of books on metaphysics and channeling, and started channeling already in the 1970s, before she attended some classes on the subject. She channeled a lot of different entities before she decided to stay with Germain, Hironi, and Sasha. Channeling Bashar was something she did in her earlier days, and this group consciousness is more known to be channeled by Daryl Anka these days. Lisa channeled RA as well before Carla's group was contacted by them. Two of the more interesting earlier channels, according to Lisa herself, were of one entity called Radia from Arcturus, and Akbar from Orion. Radia eventually turned into Germain. In a channel session, Radia told Lisa that this was the last time she'd hear from her, and a little bit later she transformed into Germain, whom we then highly suspect is connected to Enki and the Syrians. What I think people know her best from today, and what stayed most in the human consciousness, is The Prism of Lyra, a book which is more or less the story of the universe from the beginning, when life came through a prism in the Lyra star constellation into our universe, and later on moved over to Orion. Furthermore, it is explaining which star races came to Earth millions upon millions of years ago and created civilizations here. It also described how the Vegans created the dinosaurs and out of that came a reptilian race, which to some degree still lives here on Earth in underground caves and caverns, while others left the planet and went to other star systems. In other words, this channeled book is saying that at least one or a few reptilian races out there in the universe today actually originated on Earth. It also tells about the conflict between the Vegans and the Lyrans, and how mankind later on became genetically manipulated by a negative star race from Sirius, while a galactic war was raging in this sector of the universe. The way Lisa is explaining the difference between densities and dimensions is probably the best I've seen in channeled material. She explains the differences as follows. Density denotes a vibrational frequency and not a location, which the term dimension implies. The density structure of this reality is primarily expressed in 7 levels, though each level has sub-levels within it. The density scale is a model used to communicate one's perception of orientation in relation to other realities. Dimension refers to one's location in space/time rather than a person's vibrational frequency, density. Webster defines dimension as magnitude measured in a particular direction, specifically length, breadth, thickness, or time. There are an infinite number of dimensions existing with a given density or vibrational frequency. Density, as most of these sources see it, is the opening of the chakras, one by one, which in turn lifts us to higher vibrations/frequencies. As long as we're in 3D, we are reacting and acting mostly out of fear and base our decisions from that. Fear belongs to the third chakra in the body, which is controlled by the belly. The fourth chakra is the heart chakra, and this is the chakra they are concentrating on in the ascension. This is, of course, a simplified explanation of what it really is, but it works for their purposes. I explained in Level I, Genesis Paper Number 1, Human Origins and the Living Library of March 31, 2011, the history about the Zeta Reticulian Greys, partly as it was told by Hierony, the Zeta mass consciousness, and how they basically come from a planet called Apex in the Lyra star system. Once upon a time, the story goes, the Zetas were pretty much like us when comes to evolution. They, too, destroyed their planet, and the toxicity created mutations in their offspring. The babies were either stillborn, or were born with much larger skulls than their parents. This made it almost impossible for the females to have a normal birth. Then, to make a long story short, they were also invaded by another race of the Grey stock. A war broke out, which culminated in a nuclear war that ended up destroying the whole surface of Apex. The Greys thus had to live underground for many, many generations. That is supposedly how they developed their big, black eyes, so they could see in the dark where no sun ever shone. The radiation the Greys were subjected to during the nuclear war made their body more or less resistant to it, but it came with a price. They could no longer reproduce and had to learn how to clone themselves to keep the population on a more or less steady level. They lost their reproduction organs and the digestive tract atrophied, and instead began to absorb food through their skin. With time, they became a beehive community in order to survive better. What the Greys did not understand while they were living underground was that their planet, due to earlier misuse of energy, both nuclear and zero-point energy, had started breaking down the planet's energy field on a sub-quantum level. This created an electromagnetic warp in the time/space fabric around the planet. This made their world change position in the time/space continuum, and when the species one day decided to go up to the surface and check things out to see if it was perhaps inhabitable again, they noticed that the planet now revolved around a different sun in the Zeta Reticuli star system. Some Greys then stayed in their new star system, while others migrated beyond Orion, where they eventually evolved into the Essassani Greys, where Essassani is the name of their planet. To us they became known as Bashar. This is the ball part of the story that Hierony, Sasha, and sometimes Germain have been telling us in channeled sessions back in the 1990s. Furthermore, they say they have an agreement with we humans to abduct us to learn more about us, so they can regain their sexuality and their emotions by studying us. They are promising that they are not making any changes in us. This, as we shall see, is not true. They are making changes in us and are later on admitting to it. 2.1. The Zeta Agreement. Regular people, but perhaps even so the major part of abductees, have a hard time understanding what this agreement between Zetas and humans consists of. We who have researched this are aware of the TTP-DEF, Technology Transfer Programs, which is an agreement between our government and the Greys. Now, forget about the Syrians for a moment while I get to the point here, and you are going to be able to see a very interesting connection. This agreement allows the Greys to abduct a certain amount of humans in exchange for technology. The best-known agreement was that between the Greys and the President Eisenhower government in the 1950s, but abductions had been going on long before that, and Hitler had a similar agreement. The TTPs certainly took place, but they are only a part of the whole Grey scenario. The TTPs were either agreements between governments and a very negative faction of the Zetas, or the Syrians themselves, in their Grey spacesuits, but not the main part of the Grey community. Not all Greys have been involved in those TTPs, according to Hierony, Sasha, and Germain. They say that the agreement to abduct humans is made between the separate humans themselves and the Zetas on a subconscious level, or between lives. They say that they can only abduct those who are vibrating within a certain frequency and transmit a certain signal which can be picked up by the Greys. The rest of humanity can't be abducted, because the Greys, who are operating from another density, can't physically find us. In other words, those who are abducted are willingly being subjected to this, and have always given their consent, whether they remember it or not, according to our sources. Still, many who are abducted are afterwards very fearful about these events and feel both anger and terror from their experiences. They are the last to admit that they have been taken with their consent. The Greys strongly disagree. Hironi says that it all depends on how the abductee is letting themselves experiencing the event. They can meet it with fear, or they can see it as a learning experience which will benefit themselves, the Zetas, and the rest of humanity. If they choose the first alternative, the abductions are going to be very painful on many levels, but if they choose the second, the experience can be very rewarding. But what is this all about? Why are all these people actually taken? Hironi is the first to admit that the Greys lack both emotions and understanding of human pain and needs, and they totally lack the ability to have sexual thoughts and desire. When these subjects are raised, Hironi is giving us a comment we have heard many times before: they are us in the future. Oh no, you think, not them, too. We've heard that phrase so many times now that we're sick and tired of it. Why are these sources all saying the same thing? Are they all lying, or is it just proving my point in the previous paper, that they are all us in the future, but from different timelines? Yes, that's certainly how it seems to be. They are us in the future, but from different lines of time. That's the common denominator amongst all these channels we've mentioned so far. But on the other hand, it's not the first time in my papers that I've said that the Greys are us in the future. However, we are going to look at this from a different angle now and see if we can find some missing pieces, such as where the Greys come into the picture. If they are us in the future, how could things go so wrong? I already told the supposed history of the Greys and their planet, Apex, twice here in this paper and in Level I, albeit, a thought unmistakably pops up in the head when we read the story, and Hironi mentions it as well. The story is very similar to the story of humankind. Well, that's not so strange when we, in a totally different channeled session, are told that the Apex story is more or less a metaphor for humanity's own history, and even future if we don't get our act together. So, more than a real story, it's a warning for us to change our ways. However, later on Hironi refers back to this story as being partly true. For our purpose, it's actually irrelevant, as we shall see. Lissa Royal's sources all say the same thing, that humanity around this point made a collective decision, instigated by our shadow government as usual, but whatever they say normally goes and people go along with it. This decision took us on a path through a certain timeline, where we started experimenting big time with genetics. Of course, we know that this is not only something that's currently being done only by the government and the military, but is in usual manner directed by interdimensional forces, our friends, the Syrians. We have already talked about how they want to create super soldiers that are resistant to radiation and can tolerate harsh space conditions. The Syrian Alliance already knows how to do that, because they were the ones who created the Greys in their own solar system once upon a time to use as spacesuits when they go on interstellar travels, and at the same time can comfortably move around in these grey bodies on their own planet. The reason they can do that is because these grey bodies are genetically manipulated in a way so that they can tolerate the density on the Syrian home planet. Moreover, it looks like they adjusted this body template for each star race who are allies with the Syrians, such as the Alpha Draconians, so that each race, respectively, could use the grey spacesuit both for star travel and on the planets of their origins. When the Syrians and their allies first came to Earth, they came here in grey bodies. And they still mostly do. That's probably why some star beings call them Lizzies, or lizards, because they look very sauroid. In old Sumerian times we see the Anunnaki depicted mostly as humanoids, but with slightly bigger eyes. The Sumerian people probably knew that the Syrians came here as greys but jumped into human bodies when they planned on staying on Earth for a longer period of time. The greys' bodies could only stay in our 3D frequency for a short time, whereafter they had to leave. In humanoid bodies, the Syrian Alliance could stay as long as they wanted. However, Like artists often do, the Sumerian artists added a personality, or traits, to the statue or the drawing. What perhaps stands out the most on a grey body is the big, black eyes. If the Sumerians knew that the Syrians, when in space, used bodies with big, black eyes, it makes sense if they added that to the humanoid bodies in their artifact, to give a hint of their real, original appearance when space traveling. But where did the Syrians get the idea of creating grey bodies for interstellar space travel in their hollowed-out craft? It is my qualified guess, after have read Lys's and Keith's material, and others, that this is where the story about the apex planet and the Zeta Reticulians is partly true. Somewhere along the line long before the Syrians came to Earth, and probably before they encountered the Aryan Empire, they invaded the Grey World and killed off the Greys in their usual cruel manner, and used the rest as slaves, possibly on the Syrian home planet. Whether the part of the story where the Greys were subjected to nuclear radiation is true or not, perhaps the Syrians quickly noticed how easily the Grey template adapted to the conditions in space, and from there, their genetic experimentation with the Greys started, which led to that they created their half-biological, half-machine spacesuits. Before they encountered the Greys, they must have either used their own original bodies and noticed their shortcomings, or traveled in some other ways, maybe even using some kind of artificial spacesuits, like our own astronauts do, but much more high-tech. I don't have the answer to this. Now, let's go back to Earth and present time. Of course, the Syrians already know how to create efficient grey bodies because they use them all the time. Even if they have to genetically manipulate them here on Earth, and perhaps add human genes to them, it wouldn't take long for them to create Zeta/human hybrids. I wouldn't be surprised if they, in underground facilities, already have a whole army of human hybrids, ready to be used, but in suspense for now. Or, they are teaching human scientists how to do this genetic engineering from scratch. We don't know very much what's going on deep beneath our feet in those multi-leveled underground military facilities, not to speak about the bases under the ocean floors. There are whistleblowers, of course, but they are usually only low-level ex-military with limited clearance, and even if what they tell us can be horrifying, it's just the tip of the iceberg. However far they have come with their hybridization, we now have quite a clear picture of what will happen in the future. Interestingly enough, an almost identical story is told by Barbara Marciniak's Pleiadians, who otherwise very much dislike the Greys and most of the rest of the Channeling Pack, and Galactic Federations in particular. Hironi, Sasha, and Germain are telling us that far in the future mankind has become totally hybridized, with no emotions and no sexual abilities. Reproduction is done totally through cloning. But just like when you use a standard copy machine and copy paper after paper, and use copies to create new copies, eventually the text will be unreadable. It's the same with cloning a species. The Greys' DNA became distorted and the immune system so depleted that the future Grey/humans realize that their species will not survive unless something is done. So what they do is to become time jumpers. This means that they with help from technology are able to go back in time and insert themselves on our timeline from perpendicular time, a scientific term which we discussed earlier. On a linear timeline, a highly technological race like our future selves, or a race who can nano-travel, which most Greys can't, except Bashar and a couple of others, at the most, is able to go back on this linear timeline and insert themselves perpendicularly anywhere they want. What would be more appropriate than to do it here and now around the nanosecond, when the old era ends and a new has just started? This is, after all, when all the timelines merge, like we've discussed before, and we start anew from a starting point, which is now, and branch off into different futures, taking us to different destinations on multiple timelines. This is why we see different versions of Greys here, I've just found out. They are all us in the future, but in different stages of development, from different times, and perhaps even slightly different timelines. Many think these are Greys from different star systems, and that's why they look different, but apparently, that's not the case. So, the abductions by the Greys are not present-time abductions so much as they are abductions by our future selves on our present-time versions of themselves. And sometimes, say Lys's sources, they have help from more humanoid races, who are present during the abductions, to make the abductee feel safer, because they recognize the familiarity in the humanoid presence. The end result of all these abductions from the future is the Essassani race, Bashar. Supposedly, they have settled in a star system beyond what we see in the sky as the constellation of Orion. The Greys, of course, are the product of the machine kingdom, where the human race slowly and successively turns into half machines and half humans, with no emotions and no means to reproduce, a dying race. A lot of things, as we shall see soon, will happen on these machine kingdom timelines before we get to the Essassani stage. But the eerie questions is, what will happen after the Essassani society? Why does it stop there, where humanity are better off than in earlier stages where the Greys are visiting, but still quite emotionless and not able to have sex? Not a word is said about what will happen after Essassani. The following quotes are directly from the Grey Collective, Hironi, and this is what they are currently engaged in. 1. That we will assist you in triggering latent genetic codes that will propel you into an accelerated state of genetic evolution. These codes were placed in you by your forefathers and were designed to be triggered when you achieved a certain vibratory rate. This vibratory rate occurs when your consciousness accelerates. That is what is occurring now. In our work with you, when we interact with you either physically or etherically, we work with these genetic structures, these latent genetic codes. Some of them can be activated from the etheric level, some need activation on the physical level. As we have agreed to do millennia ago, we will carry out this agreement of assisting in this species triggering. 2. Even though we do not understand the concept of emotion, we seek to understand it and we watch you in order to do so. We have been told by others who interact with us that your species' goal at the present time is in expressing and then integrating your fears. Even though we do not understand why, we understand that our interactions with you promote fear in some people. It is not our desire to promote fear in you, but those we interact with who are guardians to you tell us that your confrontation with your fear is of vital importance at this time in your development. Though we do not intentionally desire to trigger your fear, we are made aware that our interactions with you do in fact trigger that fear. I was just listening to a CD by the Pleiadians from late summer 2012, where they said that a group of Pleiadians who are still willing to use weaponry to protect Earth and themselves, apart from Marciniak's group, who are against weapons, are currently in battle with the Greys here in the solar system, trying to chase them off. Whether they are succeeding or not, I don't know yet, but Marciniak's Pleiadians were not too optimistic about it if I should trust my feelings and senses when I listened to it. To the Pleiadians, the Greys 100% represent the machine kingdom, I can tell. Like I said, they too tell us that the Greys who are operating here in our solar system to a large degree are us in the future. In one of the more recent lectures, they finally explain what the tyranny in the Pleiades in our future, their present, is all about, and it's more to it than I have told before. They say that at around this time, in the nanosecond, we humans made a choice to create a very high-tech society, the so-called machine kingdom. Of course, it's all run by the Syrians, but humanity, more or less as a whole, chose to go in that direction. Not many people chose the more natural path, away from the technology, a technology which consequences later may become humanity's Achilles heel, at least on one or more timelines. Eventually, say the Pleiadians, humanity is going to turn into half robot and half human and start exploring space. And not only that, we are also going to start conquering other worlds. Doesn't this sound like the Syrian evolution all over again? Only, this time the Syrians are in charge of using humans to do their job, which is more like a rehearsal for bigger tasks, like taking over Orion. Eventually, in a distant future, the tyranny we spread is going to reach the Pleiades, and supposedly, on a certain timeline, we will conquer the Pleiades and start a tyranny there. A rebel group of Pleiadians, who in fact are Syrian/Pleiadian descendants, once upon a time the creators of the Nephilim, and the ones who also used their DNA in the mix to create Homo sapiens sapiens, are leaving their bodies and meet in the ether in a safe place, where they can channel their message through time and space. Through their vehicle, Barbara Marciniak, they then reach humans such as myself via their lectures. So, what the Pleiadian rebels say they did was to trace back the tyranny in the Pleiades to our present time, where there is a fork in the road, and people choose different probabilities to create their own timelines in the multiverse. Like I mentioned, in versions of the nanosecond, on other timelines, where the Pleiadians are not present, only a few chose not to go for the option to create a machine kingdom. As usual, most humans were oblivious that they chose a timeline which would lead to such a catastrophic future. They were just fascinated by all the cool technology, and one thing slowly led to another. Apparently, there are thousands upon thousands of people around the world who listen to the Pleiadian lectures and get the message. What they want to do is to slightly change the timelines, and by educating people so they can make more conscious choices, the tyranny will hopefully disappear in the future, their present time. Those of us who take their teachings to heart, but also start thinking on their own and do their own research, one by one help changing the vibration of the mass consciousness, and more major changes will occur that will create more distinct options. The Pleiadians are suggesting in their lectures that we choose to evolve without technology, just by natural means, which is done through education and willingness to change accordingly to the changes in our belief systems. As usual, they ask us to use discernment even when listening to them, and it's our choice if we want to believe what they teach us. The Pleiadians were the first to suggest we go back to nature, which doesn't mean we need to throw out all technology, some of it can still be of assistance to us. Technology in itself is not bad, it depends on how we use it. But it's important that we don't let technology run our lives, and that we only use it when we see it can really enhance our living. In other words, they suggest we create a totally new timeline, based on what they've taught us. Thus far, they are quite pleased and say that bigger changes than we think have been made in the mass consciousness. Most people will still choose the machine kingdom, but many more than anticipated will now choose the timeline that leads to natural evolution without harvest or gray intervention. We may not always notice this, because not everybody who wake up are blogging or participating in discussions on the internet. But shouldn't we help the Greys, then? After all, they are our descendants. Well, that's what the fork in the road is all about. Some souls, especially in the afterlife, apparently, made the decision to assist the Greys to achieve their goals. They probably did so because they thought that the Greys are now our future, and if we want a better future than what they have produced so far, we'd better help them. Therefore, they have agreed to spend perhaps more than one lifetime as guinea pigs and abductees for the Greys. In the future, a branch of humanity will realize that the choices they made were non-survival and want to go back and change things, but personally I am not going to be a slave to the Syrians anymore and choose the machine kingdom even if it's to help our future selves. In fact, if we choose the natural way to evolve, we are creating a brand new species, and the Greys are no longer our descendants in that sense after we've branched out. What they want to do and how they do it is their solution to the problem, but I for one am not going to get involved in it. I know there are many more people, perhaps you who read this, who will think like me. And besides, the machine kingdom does not end with the Essassani, probably. It will continue in one form or another. And somewhere along the line, things will branch off again, for sure, and one branch will go for attacking Orion, because that's the Syrians' goal, apparently. With all this in mind, it may be a whole lot easier for people to make a choice. However, it's very important that we understand what choices we make. In the next section I want to quote a channeled session between a group of Zeta Greys and a human being from the audience. It is all happening during a Bashar section. The channeler is Daryl Anka.